Hi folks, Rob Goller here. Thank you for joining me for our weekly chat about local history. Appreciate you supporting the project as always. A couple people have been asking me about the history of the Erie County Fair, and since we are in the midst of the Erie County Fair right now, um, and its connection to the town of Aurora and East Aurora, we actually hosted the fair twice here in our town, and it was hosted at what is today Hamlin Park. I would talk about it, but I already talked about it last year. So what I'm going to do is post a link later this week to that original video. I'm going to rewatch the video to make sure that things are still in context. But already talked about that. Another thing that folks have been talking about quite a bit, of course, is the election, the presidential election. And as I had promised, in talking in previous videos that in the upcoming weeks as we get closer to the election, I want to talk a little bit more about East Aurora's kind of unique connections to not only presidential history, but just national elections and things like that. And as we're talking about elections, and I hear things in the media, I hear things in the news, and sometimes people act like it's unprecedented, that we have never seen things like this before. And in my head, I'm thinking, no, we've seen this before. So I try to dig out examples of how what we're seeing today has also happened in the past. And one of those things is political bias in the media. And we've heard for years now that there are complaints from people about the political bias of the media. And in most cases, it's the national media. So, for instance, Democrats will complain about Fox News being too right wing. They're not presenting the news in a unbiased fashion. And then, the conservatives will complain about MSNBC, for instance, or the New York Times being just the propaganda machine for the Democratic Party. And you'll hear this on both sides, and people will complain about it. But this is nothing new. The media has been politically biased since the beginning. We like to have this idea in our head that the media is supposed to be politically unbiased in presenting the news. They do that themselves. They'll say, "We report, you decide," is one of the slogans. That they're not taking a political stand, and that we think that somehow that anybody who is politically biased, any news organization that is politically biased, is somehow doing something out of the ordinary and brand new, when in fact this has been happening for a very, very long time. And big city newspapers have been doing this, particularly in the late 1800s. But our local newspapers are a shining example of how political bias, can get into the local media. Now, with that said, was not always seen as a bad thing, and actually the media did this on purpose. They made no qualms about it. So today you'll hear news organizations that will present themselves as unbiased, but they really are biased. And then you'll see newspapers where they'll be determined whether they're liberal or conservative or somewhere middle of the road based on their editorials, who they endorse as political candidates. But back in the history of our newspapers, just here in our own little communities, you can see just in the newspaper coverage, not just on the editorial pages, blatantly on the front page, where the newspaper stood, and they ended up actually being propaganda machines for the political parties. Now, we've had more than 20 newspapers here in East Aurora. Well, 20 if you count. I counted newspapers. We did an exhibit, and I wrote a little bit a few years ago about the history of newspapers in the community, and I counted more than 20, but some of them could not be considered newspapers. They were publications. They might have had a little bit of news, but to be true newspapers, there's actually a specific requirement, I would think. So your penny savers, and there were a couple newspapers that were promoted that way, but they were actually put out by businesses or like the Chamber of Commerce sort of thing, where it was mostly advertising. But we probably had more than a dozen honest-to-goodness newspapers here in the community, including the East Aurora Advertiser and the East Aurora Bee, which are still publishing today. But So we actually go back to the 1830s with the Aurora Standard, and we believe that was the first newspaper published here in East Aurora. And what is really funny, especially as it pertains to the topic we're talking about today, is in their inaugural issue, the Aurora Standard came out and said, we are going to be a newspaper that's unbiased, politically unbiased, and present the news in an unbiased way, politically and otherwise, but mostly politically. And it didn't take very long for them to go back on that promise. They became the Aurora Standard, even though it promoted itself in the beginning as an independent paper politically. It soon became a promoter of the Whig Party, which of course was Millard Fillmore's party. And there's actually headlines right in the paper that would tell, the election of 1836 right at the top. They would just mention the candidates of the Whig Party for president, so William Henry Harrison and Francis Granger, and for governor and all the races, but they wouldn't even mention the other side. So they would promote the candidates that they wanted to promote, and ignore the other side. So not unbiased at all. And it may have been on their editorial page, but they didn't. In big letters, they would have the name of the candidates for the Whig Party. A few years later, a newspaper called the Aurora Democrat came out, and they, as the name, a lot of small town papers and some big city newspapers, they would put the political party that they supported right in the title, and this was the case. So it was the Democratic Republican Party, the Democrat Party, and from the beginning they supported the Democratic Party. Now we don't have an actual copy of the newspaper Aurora Democrat. I would love to have a copy of that, but they were published in the 18. They came around in 1835 and as competition to the Aurora Standard. And what we know about the Aurora Democrat is what the Aurora Standard said about them. And it was a rivalry for the time that they were publishing. The Aurora Standard supported the Whig Party, and the Aurora Democrat supported the Democrat Republican Party. And they would counter each other in each issue. And the Democrat would support their candidates and their stance on national and state issues, and then the Aurora Standard would come out the following week, and it would be a debate back and forth, and it was quite a rivalry. Would have been one of the reasons I want to get copies of the Aurora Democrat is I'd love to see that debate on both sides. We're only seeing the one side because we have the Aurora Standard microfilmed, so we can research that. But I would love to see that back and forth, the honest-to-goodness debate about politics between the newspapers. They did not pretend to be unbiased, and it was right in their news pages. So they would, right on the front page, the Aurora Democrat would be promoting the Democratic Republican Party, and in the Aurora Standard, they'd be promoting the Whig Party. And that's just the way it was, and that was what was expected. There was not this expectation of independence, even though that was sort of their marketing strategy as they started out. Now, the Aurora Democrat didn't last very long, unfortunately, so we didn't have those competing newspapers for very long. Unfortunately, what happens to a lot of newspapers in our community is that the population and the business base at the time did not. I mean, we only had like 1,000 people in the town, the whole town, at the time, and so they couldn't support two newspapers, and so the Democrat went away, and the Aurora Standard stayed around for I think 4 years, but still not very long. But that was a great example in the early days of the political unbiased newspapers and the political rivalries between newspapers just in our small little towns. We often think of it as something that was happening in the big cities, but it was happening here in our towns. And newspapers, in many cases, were started in order to promote the political parties, their political parties. Now remember that today our political campaigns have TV ads. They can call you on your phone. They can send you emails and all sorts of, send you things in the mail, the mailers before Election Day. Back then, they didn't have that. they would use the newspapers, and the newspapers were the communication arm of the political parties for all intents and purposes, based on what where the publisher stood on political issues. Now, another newspaper came along. Now, the East Aurora Advertiser started in 1872. Uh, they also started out as politically unbiased. I'll talk a little bit about that. But in the 1880s, a newspaper called the Weekly Times, and it became the Aurora Times, started. And again, they also were promoting themselves as a politically nonpartisan newspaper. But right on the front page, as an example, they soon became a promoter of the Republican Party in the 1880s, and it was very obvious. Now, they didn't come out on their on the front page of the newspaper saying we are a Republican newspaper, the Weekly Times, but one fantastic example of their bias was on the front page in the 1880s. Um, Excuse me, 1880 presidential election. They had said that they were thrilled that all the Republicans had done so well, and there was this North-South still in 1880 rivalry, bitter rivalry between the political parties. And the Weekly Times supported the Republican Party quite aggressively. And so James Garfield won most of the northern states, and Winfield Scott Hancock dominated the South. Um, and so there were this election. What stunned me is in the headline they said that the Republicans dominated, but they said the enemy annihilated. So the newspaper, right in its front page headline, was noting that was referring to the opposite party in the South, where there was this North-South faction, and again, that was happening during Reconstruction and after the war, Civil War. So it's not just today that we see this North-South political difference, the red and blue states, but to refer to the opposite political party or the opposite political side, either geographically or party, as the enemy, and to refer to them as annihilated right in the front page. Was quite stunning when you consider that newspapers are supposed to be quote unquote unbiased. So that was happening in 1880 and after the 1880 election. After that newspaper touted themselves as an independent local newspaper in the beginning, and they certainly were not independent in their views of the 1880 election after they were reporting the results. So again, the newspaper had a very, very strong political bias. Now, moving forward, now this was quite common in the late 1800s into the early 1900s. But you get into the 1970s, and even then, so the East Aurora Advertiser had a reputation of being a Republican newspaper for many, many years. They didn't come out on the front page like calling the Democrats the enemy or anything, but there were a group of folks in the community who felt that the Advertiser in the 1970s was biased, and they said so on the front page, and they called it the Aurorical. So they started their own newspaper called the Aurorical, and they didn't come out and say that the Advertiser was Republican. But if you looked at the Aurorical, and there are people still around who helped publish that, you look at the reporters and the people putting it out. It was a group of volunteers in the community. They were mostly Democrats. So the Democrats were putting out a newspaper against the Advertiser to counter what the Advertiser was reporting and not reporting. And at that point, the town board and the local politics were almost all Republican. And so they felt that there was not enough, whether it was justified or not, they felt that the East Aurora Advertiser was not publishing everything about local government. So they published their own called the Aurorical. So as we got into the 20th century, the newspapers did have a political slant, but it wasn't as obvious as it would have been in the 1880s and 1890s, where the newspapers are, putting just their political candidates' profiles on the front page of the newspaper, and then celebrating or not celebrating and calling the opposition the enemy. Um, it was a little more, it was a little different, but there were still some political biases, or perceived political biases anyway, in local media through into the late 20th century. So that was still happening. So there was a political bias, or a perceived political bias. Now, this wasn't just an East Aurora issue, an East Aurora phenomena. This happens in small towns across the country. So, and when I worked in Warsaw in Wyoming County, there were newspapers. Um, and I remember researching the newspapers as part of my job as the editor of the current newspaper at the time. Um, and I was looking past in old newspapers, and right across the front page, there'd be competing newspapers in Wyoming County. And right across the front page, they'd tell you who to vote for, like vote straight Republican or vote straight Democrat. Made no qualms about it. And this is going into the 20th century. So, it was just an obvious political bias, and they made no qualms about it. It wasn't they were trying to be secretive about it or sneaky. The newspaper had a political bias, and they presented their side. And it's a concept that we have gotten away from today, and we think isn't something that we should be doing. But that's what a lot of local newspapers were doing, and that was a big part of their purpose, is to promote a political agenda. I just was able to go online and look up a copy of the Wyoming County Times, which was a newspaper there, and in the election of 1912. The Democrat Woodrow Wilson won the presidential election, and the newspaper actually across the front page said, "We won." So we being the Democrats, so they were promoting a certain political agenda, and when that political side, the Democrats, won the election, they referred to the victory as a "we won." So that was a very blatant political bias on a news story, not just in their editorials. So if you look through history in local newspapers, just be careful about that. Like, especially if we're researching politics and elections, you might not get the whole story, because newspapers, part of their job was to promote a political agenda. And so when I hear today people talking about Fox News or MSNBC, and we're acting like, oh, the good old days when the media wasn't biased, that is not true. The media has been biased throughout American history. And if you just look at local newspapers, you will see it. There's a great examples in local towns of media bias. It's not a new phenomena. So get that idea out of your head. We have to get that idea out of our heads, that there was some time in our history where the media was unbiased. We have always had a biased media. Maybe today they're not as open about what their bias is, but their bias is still there. But in the past, they may have been, especially in the late 1800s, made no qualms about what their bias was. So that might be the difference. That in the past, the bias was obvious, and it was stated bias, but the bias was still there. So. History does repeat itself. History is rhyming today, and with the past. Our present day politics is rhyming with the past, and we don't have we've not really ever had an unbiased media. They'll tell you that, and I worked in local newspapers, and I tried my best, but there's always a bias, whether it's political or otherwise. We're human beings, and so there's a bias, and it's inherent. But in the early days of newspapers, particularly in the late 1800s, mid 1800s to late 1800s, even in small towns, the purpose of a newspaper was to promote a political agenda, and that's just the way it was. So it's nothing new. Again, thank you for joining me for this week's History Chat. I'm here every week on Tuesdays, but a lot of you watch as it replays on YouTube. It's also available on YouTube and on Facebook. Again, thank you so much for joining me, and if you have any ideas, you are doing great at sending them to me, either via the comments or through a private message. Some of you do that as well. And thank you so much. The numbers keep going up of people viewing, and I really appreciate that. And I've had some people reach out from out of state who are appreciating what we're chatting about here. So that's really wonderful. And I did hit a couple milestones with the viewership. It keeps going up and up, so I appreciate that. Again, I'm Robert Goller. I am the Town and Village Historian, but these videos and a lot of my research are not officially connected with my position as Town and Village Historian. Again, thank you for joining me. Thank you for keeping history alive, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.